My name is Steve Whittaker. I specialize in architectural interior and occasionally aerial photography. We can talk about that later. Uh, what else can I say? I now live in Oregon. I used to be
Mhm.
a San Francisco Bay Area person. I grew up, I'm three generations San Francisco Bay Area. We moved up here to be closer to family. I've got three,
Mhm.
anyhow, it's been a wonderful experience. Moving is a moving experience without any question. But
That's
it's downsizing. What do you downsize? What do you eliminate? And then the process of actually moving up here and then restarting your business when you move up. When I
mhm.
first arrived up in Oregon, I noticed people, especially in the architectural photographic market, were charging real estate prices. I mean, a lot of them were wondering why they were out of business within a very short time. They tried transferring their real estate pricing into the architectural photography or commercial realm, and it affects everybody. And that's one reason why I jumped back on the bandwagon and started uh, presenting my seminars again. I was just really outraged by seeing what people were undercharging, and it
Mm.
affects everybody in the process. And in the process, on top of that, they're damaging the market by doing it.
Mhm.
So it's hard.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the things that Craddock has long talked about. If people don't know how to charge, they're often not charging enough. So therefore, they're ultimately damaging the entire marketplace by devaluing.
And they're out of business before they realize it. On top of that, they've paid for that equipment or they're leasing it, and all of a sudden they're stuck with a lot of bills. I think you were asking what your aha moment is, and uh, I started out. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do when I grew up, so I started out at the community college level, just kind of grazing. I took photographic courses, and I fell in love with it. And I figured you can't make a living doing that. So I got injured in a judo accident, so I had time off, and a friend of my mom's, started presenting me with all these brochures to Art Center, all these expensive art schools, Brooks, and
Mhm.
I looked at the price tag, and I just said, "You got to be kidding!" I guess I'm a cheapskate at heart. What else can I say? But turns out he was director of public relations for Shell Oil. I had no clue. They went to high school together, and he became kind of a mentor. One of
Mm.
my first mentors.
Nice.
He put me in touch with an art director who was with a major firm in San Francisco, and that was a big help. He introduced me to a new realm, and advertising just looked like a sparkling, amazing, incredible industry until I got into it. Crash. Um, when I ended up going to San Jose State, that became my major after I got my AA at the community college level, and it was a wonderful transition getting into it. But the more I started seeing advertising, I started having question marks. I worked as a production artist from 1975 after I graduated and did freelance photography. But I think one of the changing moments for me, I did my very first commercial for a company that made hydraulic rams. And what do you charge? I don't know. How does 500 sound? It turned into a 16-hour day. I didn't know about rights. I didn't know a thing. Now, a friend of mine who had a studio for about 3 or 4 years, we went to school together, took photographic classes. And at the time, this is 1977, I guess. He was, uh, I think, president of PPA at that time as well. And just an amazing guy. And we had a very frank conversation to the point where he asked me what I charged in that job. I got the biggest horse laugh of my life. And it was a wake up call for me. I wish more people would do that to each other. This is a community, and we need to work together and share. And I'll get into that a little bit later on when we get into pricing and
Mhm.
dealing with overreaching terms. It was one of the biggest wake up calls I had, and I realized Um, it was a moment that I needed to take a second look. So I started shopping around, asking other people what they were charging. And photo quote obviously wasn't around back then. At least I wasn't aware of it. Uh, and I bumped it up to 1500 for a job that was back then. Day rates was a term, and it still is. Unfortunately, it doesn't really describe what we do. We'll talk about pricing again. It's a bad habit of mine. I keep jumping into it, and I apologize. But Uh, I mentioned it to the art director, and he broke out laughing. I was wondering how long it would take you before you woke up. And we started working together, and we had a wonderful working relationship for quite a while. I ended up getting projects out on the Big Island, Hawaii. Moving
Nice.
anvil cases was a huge experience for me, especially when you didn't have an assistant. I was working without an assistant. That was a big experience and a wake up
Mm.
call, also, especially shipping 10 anvil cases through uh, uh, not customs, I forget what they call it now, but anyhow, they inspected everything. And trying to get a rental car on your own way you have all this equipment is something else. So that was my second wake up call, the value of people assisting. I was lighting up a very large building. It wasn't that large, but lighting became a big part of my career, and I'll talk about that later.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
that was my wake up call. I fell in love with photography in the beginning, and once I started exploring professional trade organizations, not photo clubs, and that's really something that I want your viewers to look at. Professional trade organizations like ASMP, American Society of Media Photographers, and Professional Photographers of America. They have got chapters all over the country. I joined PPFA first in 1973 when I was still in college because I really wanted to continue exploring photography as a career as well as advertising. And when I graduated, I felt like I needed more training, so I went up to the Academy of Art College in San Francisco,
Mhm.
Academy of Art University. And in order to teach her, you had to be a leader in the field. And one of my instructors was a creative director. We're doing storyboard production. He came in one night with a really glum expression. I said, "Dave, what's going on?" He'd been with that account for 18 years. They'd had the airline account for 26 years. One argument between the account executive's wife and the ad manager's wife at a cocktail party killed that relationship. And I started
Wow.
wondering, that was my first point of preparing to do a 180 and bail out of advertising. And I decided it's time. So I kept doing little freelance production art jobs. And then I joined a color lab doing outside sales. And I had a chance to really meet with a lot of photographers. Again, at that point, I didn't have a clue. I was still learning. So it was an opportunity to join a local chapter of PPFA. And they have seminars, they have print competitions, which was a wonderful learning experience for me. Uh, and then I joined ASMP in 1983, 10 years later. And 1995, 96, PPFA, Professional Photographers of America, dropped their commercial group. And I bailed. I said,
Mm.
I'm not a portrait wedding. I did 5 weddings. I said, no, thank you. And I ran as fast as I could. I admire anybody that does weddings. My hat's off to them, but I just didn't have the personality for it. Uh,
Absolutely.
So I worked for a couple of color labs for a while. We're still in the introductory stage, just my background,
Mm.
professional labs. And I, uh, the lab manager started a new company and it sounded attractive, so I joined them. About a month and a half later, I had to explain to an art director why they were missing their deadline. He explained to me why he was losing his job and they lost the account. And I gave my 2 weeks notice to the color lab and I started Claustrophobia Studios until the fire marshal found out. Then I had a real studio in Belmont, California. So that was that. And I was there until the '89 quake. And we had an art
Mm.
director from Dallas, Texas in the studio, and she'd never experienced a quake before. She was having a hard time. It was a wooden structure, so it survived quite easily. But I realized I needed to move closer to home, so I moved my studio to Foster City so I could be within 6 miles of walking distance. And I was there until 2010. And during the recession, 2006 to 2009, I kept wondering, why am I paying rent when I could work out of my home? And
Mhm.
as things progressed to around 2008, I pretty much stopped using the studio except for storage. I wasn't doing product photography anymore. I did a lot of architectural scale models, so I was using it for that. Um, and I'll talk about one specific case where it was another learning experience about security. If you can remind me later, because that one is kind of funny. But 1980 or 2010, I closed my studio. My studio manager was a wonderful guy and still is, and we're still in touch. I've been so fortunate. The people I've worked with the exception of two people, we're good friends and we stay in touch every so often.
Right.
And it's just, I value those relationships. Uh,
Absolutely.
the two people, one assistant went around hugging clients. I said, "You're out of here." Another one came up to it was her first time with me. We were photographing the Iwani Hotel in Yosemite, shooting interiors. She handed the interior designer her business card. "I'm cheaper than this guy," and I asked her to step outside. I told her to bye, see ya. Uh,
Wow.
yep. So if you're assisting, think about the people you're working with and treat their clients like you'd want to treat your clients. I treat my clients the same way when I go on site. They're their clients, and I treat them with as much respect as I can. Fast forwarding, 2013, we moved to Oregon, just south of Portland, and I love it up here. It's wonderful. It's a great environment. It's a wonderful photographic community. ASMP has a wonderful chapter up here. We just had PDX squared, and we're going to do it again next year. And
Awesome.
PDX squared is an amazing experience. If anybody wants to talk about it, check with ASMP Oregon and go on their website. There's a lot of information there. Again, it's American Society of Media Photographers. And I just want to say again, Craddock Software has been a wonderful supporter of ASMP and with my seminars that I give around the country.
Mhm.
So thank you for that.
Always grateful for the opportunity to support the community.
Well, you did great. As an actor from the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, Walter Brennan used to say, no brag, just fact.
I like it. I like it a lot. So the photography industry, you've been around for a decade or two, and the industry has changed a lot. For you, what sticks out the most about how the industry has changed?
Where do I start? Starting with film I made the transition a little late into 2006, switching to digital, and I felt like I was selling my kids when I unloaded my Hasselblads, my
Mhm.
Nikons, my Sinars. I donated my Sinars to the local community college because nobody was buying them back then. And so that transition to digital was a wake up call. Fortunately, I had studio managers that handled all the post production because I didn't have a clue.
Right.
So I started learning from them. Uh, and that was a gradual change. 2010, I closed the studio, and one of my assistants, Ray Asuna, was just, he was amazing. He still is an amazing person. Uh, he continued to work with me doing post production work for a while until I learned how to do it myself. I decided it was time to grow up and be a big boy. So I had to
Mhm.
learn to do it. And when I moved up
Suck
here,
it up and do it, right?
yep. There's a gentleman who has a company called Digital Darkroom, and his name is Mark Fitzgerald. He's a member of our chapter of ASMP and
Okay.
also PPFA Oregon. And he was a huge, tremendous help with me with his seminars. And he also does individual training sessions. And that was a big help with me getting into Photoshop and Lightroom. That was
Mm,
my job, and I've never looked back. It's just one of those things where, except to thank him. Uh,
right.
and he didn't pay me to say that. Okay.
It's not a paid endorsement.
No. But, no, it's amazing the changes. I was sad to see them going towards in one way, towards monetizing it the way they have, where you have to buy a subscription now instead of
Mhm.
being able to own it. That was a huge hit, and it's expensive, but the updates that they have constantly are a huge help for the most part. I've really enjoyed, especially with Lightroom and again Photoshop, all the updates. Um, the changes in the computer industry. One of the worst ones was Napster, way back. I guess it was
Mhm.
what, 25, 30 years ago. Sharing images.
Right.
What is intellectual property? It's
Right.
no, go ahead, you can have it. No, you can't. And there's another thing called the orphan work, which ASMP was huge in combating and working internationally with other organizations.
Mhm.
You can't find the creator of the image. Who has access to it? You do until you're caught. And it's
Right.
one of those things, the only people that win are the attorneys unless you were able to work it out between you. And when they strip metadata, which unfortunately most uh, social networking groups do, they strip the
Mhm.
majority of the metadata. So there's, in a lot of cases, you can't find out who the creator of the image was. Registering your work, we can talk about that later, but that's important. But the registration process has evolved where it's so much easier in a lot of ways and it became a little more difficult. But the US Copyright Office, I highly recommend registering your work if you haven't. And there was a period of time where I, from 2010 to 2013, we had a lot of family issues. My wife developed lung cancer during that time.
So sorry.
And between that and the move, she survived and she came through. She's a champ.
Wow.
She came through that, but I failed to register my work. I was just trying to go through that and other things that we were dealing with at the time. And I found out through Tom Madry, our general counsel, yes, you can register it later on. So I went ahead and re-registered some of the work or registered it. And it's a huge help having people like that. ASMP has a general counsel. If you're a member, you have access to that person, along with just a broad range of information that we developed over the past, uh, I would say, since 1944, but primarily from the, I would say, 80s and on. I became
Mhm.
my background, part of it was, you're asking about mentors. I've had several. Morton Beebe was one of my mentors when I became a board member of the ASMP NorCal chapter, which is now, I think, ASMP San Francisco. And he was our chairperson at the time, and he just gave me so much advice on copyright, intellectual property, and I
Mm.
owe him an awful lot. He's got quite a story. But I know I'm getting into the weeds again. There's a bad habit of mine. Squirrel. Okay, so anyhow, uh, it's just one of those things where you learn from your colleagues, you learn from people that you
Mhm.
work with, and especially when you're within these trade associations, if you get involved with them, you can't help but learn. I found when we had our board meetings or retreats, you learn so much about the industry, but also about equipment because you're more
Right.
on a one-to-one basis. It's invaluable having those experiences.
Yeah. 100%. And I know that ASMP does such great work. What advice would you give people starting out in looking at photography as an industry and a profession?
I think the number one point I would make is starting out, get as much of a formal education as you can from an organization or from an academic uh, uh, venue
Mm.
where it's not just a level of working a camera, but that gets deeper into the culture of photography as well as the technique. The equipment is on top of that, but also if you're exploring getting into the actual industry, start searching for the areas that you're interested in and try and diversify as much as you can. Like I said, I ran from weddings as fast as I could because that didn't fit my passion.
Mhm.
Architecture, I studied architecture initially. I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but I
Mm.
initially studied architecture, graphic design, as well as photography at the community
Oh,
college level.
interesting.
And that fueled my passion. Another thing, people ask me, what do I sell my work for? The first thing I tell them is I don't, I license it. And you're setting a tone immediately when you do that. In my seminars, that's pretty much how I start my seminar as well. So everybody here got a freebie. It's just so important to let people know that you do not own your images. You've
Right.
licensed the images. When you are building your estimate, it's clearly um, mentioned that you own the images. Your terms and conditions. ASMP has a whole section on creating your forms, and I highly recommend joining ASMP and then going into that website. Again, they didn't pay me to say this. I've been a member of ASMP since 1983, and they have been such a tremendous help. They used to freely offer that information, but they realized too many people were getting them for free, so they decided you have to become a member. But they have so many different areas. They have an academy. They also have um, paperwork that you can explore, different kinds. I built my estimate invoice form. It's all in one originally from theirs. And originally it was 4 or 5 pages. I said, nobody's going to read this. So I was able to make it concise. My fee structure and expenses are broken down on one side. And I'll freely send you a copy of my invoice estimate form,
Oh, nice. Thank
include the
you.
terms and conditions. So, and I share it with anybody. It's important. Um, it's one of those things where it clearly spells out license for usage will not be released until payment is received in full. That's a key clause to have in there.
For sure.
Another one is a retainer, not a deposit.
Right.
I've had so many cases where that retainer has come in handy. And a retainer, the difference between a retainer, a deposit, you have to get the money back if they demand it. With a retainer, no, they don't. They don't get it back. It's a retainer.
Right.
So I charge a 50% retainer upfront before the assignment. I had one case in Las Vegas where I was doing an assignment on the MGM campus. And I was really excited working with this ad agency on the East Coast. Uh, and decided to treat him to dinner. So it was the creative director, the art director, art buyer, uh, account executive, and some other person. And they handed me this form, and it was a purchase order. This is another thing I want people to be aware of. Purchase orders sometimes can be plain and simple, and sometimes they can be completely contrary to what you're planning on getting into. In this case,
Right.
it had the term buyout, which is a very loose phrase. Buyout, it can mean anything. It had work made for hire, which means I become an employee of them. You already know that.
Hmm.
No, I'm not going to do that. And it had a whole bunch of other things. My favorite was uh, I was going to be responsible for any errors that they make with my images. Uh, no, I'm not going to indemnify them unless they indemnify me as well. It mirrors each other. And I
Hmm.
looked at them. I said, I really appreciate your paying the retainer in advance. Please tell your attorneys that uh, if you don't cross these terms out that are on your purchase order, I'm walking away with your retainer. And they started nudging each other and laughing. I said, okay, what's so strange about this? And they all started signing off and giggling. I said, what's so funny? I said, Steve, it's the attorneys, not us. We want to work with you, but they've put these terms in because they're trying to get as much for their client as possible. Attorneys aren't bad people. They do what they have to do for their clients. They're serving their clients. I
Right.
hope I'm not talking too fast, but I get really
No,
passionate
all
about
good.
this. Um,
Tons of great information.
I used to talk a lot faster. The only time it benefited me was 18. I worked at a gas station. I talked way out of a holdup. But
Good for you.
too much information. Okay. Well, anyhow, it was one of those things where you're facing something that is not just affecting you, but the entire industry. If you go along with that, you're caving in, and you can't do that.
Hmm.
And that retainer gives you the power to walk away from something if you find their terms are uncomfortable. That's
Yeah.
that's one thing
Great
that is
point.
so important to put a very strong emphasis on is that retainer is a key factor. So
Absolutely.
so again, on my estimate form, a client will um, part of my terms and conditions. I need to receive a check in advance or a payment in advance. The 50% and the balance could be net 1030 from that standpoint.
Mhm. Nice. Excellent. So you've talked a little bit about licensing, which of course is near and dear to Craddock's heart, and understanding not only having licenses, but then being able to follow up on licenses and get people to re-up on the licenses is great. Negotiating, you hit a little bit on that when you talked about your dinner with the people from the East Coast. Can you share a little bit more about negotiating your prices with people?
Yeah. Well, one thing, I work with architects, construction companies, and I don't want them to feel nickel and dime. In their
Mm.
case, they don't have that kind of a budget where they re-up. But I do want to talk about something, getting back to intellectual property. I found, and I'll
Mhm.
get back to negotiating in a minute. I just want to make sure I don't forget to include this part because it's important. But I found back in around New Year's Eve 2005, I went to this one company's website and I saw none of my images on there. It was a clear copyright violation. This is before I really started registering my work.
Mm.
Um, and it was something my son taught me one of my best lessons. Write the first 10 letters and tear them up and start number 11 after you take about 10 deep breaths. And I sent him an email. I realized the best way to document this is by email. So I went ahead and sent the director of marketing an email. But before I did that, I called up their receptionist. You got a great website. How long have you been using? How long has your website been up? Oh, we just set it up last week. Oh, okay. So much for the time period. And I said, well, who's your director of marketing? They gave me the person's name. So I reached out to her after she came back from vacation, and I told her what was going on. She said, "Well, I thought we owned the images." I said, "Absolutely not. The client agreement that I have is and this is another key term in estimates. My images are non-transferable to third parties. Any third
Right.
party requesters must uh, request usage or licensing directly through Steve Whittaker, Whittaker Photography. So that is another key phrase, and it's important. Um, I basically said, I'm going to be invoicing you. Have you used these images anywhere else? No, no, this is just it. And so I took her at face value. So I went ahead and set her an invoice. Um, about 3 weeks passed. I called again, and she wasn't responding. So I called again. I called and I sent her a couple of emails. And I finally got a call from the president of the company. It was an engineering firm. And I found a lot of engineering firms are just plain cheap. They try and get away with as much as they can. They said, Mr. Whittaker, we own these images. I said, absolutely not. I sent your marketing person a copy of my contract with the architect, and it has those clear terms that these images are non-transferable. I didn't see that. And I understand, sir, that sometimes somebody may think that they have access to the images where they might pass it on to you, but you absolutely clearly do not. Tell you what, I'll write a check, but for a complete buyout, I said no because my client would be really upset if I did that. Oh no, we're good. No, absolutely not. That's not going to happen. And I'll specify terms. Tell me how you want to use the marketing images. Tell me what your needs are. And I found working with people is one of the best ways. My golden retriever taught me the best thing about working with people. Just smile occasionally,
Mhm.
and don't growl too often.
Right.
I found working with people is one of the easiest ways to make things happen, and I try it as much as I can. You're talking about negotiating. I got a check Federal Express the next day for the specific license. This is way back when faxes were still working. It was almost after telegraph, just after
Right.
they stopped, after they started cutting the wires to the telegraph poles. Um, so that was a good lesson for me. Lesson number two, I worked with Hewlett Packard in an advertising agency. We did an executive briefing center at Palo Alto. Client was really happy with the work. About a month and a half later, I see my image in the San Jose Business Journal on a full page ad, and it was for the construction company. I never licensed to the construction company. I called
Mm.
this guy up, and I could picture this guy with a big Cuban cigar in his mouth and a hard hat on his head saying, no, I own the images. He had a wonderful New York accent. And I apologize to anybody because I'm probably butchering that accent. But he uh, he was convinced that he had free access to the images. And after about 15 minutes of going around in circles, I got a job for you. I want you to do this job. I pay you good money. Let's deal with this first issue, and then we'll take care of that job. I really appreciate it, but we need to settle this first. Okay, okay. But I want you to know, I still own the, sir, you don't understand. There's a thing called the 1976 copyright law. Whoever creates the images owns the images.
Right.
And this is before I understood the value of registering my work. So
Right.
we settled on an arrangement where he had access to the images one more time after this, and he paid for the previous usage plus the upcoming usage. And then
Right.
he did another image with, about 3 weeks later, I saw another one of my images, completely unrelated. So we went around in circles. He said, my attorney's going to want to talk to you. I said, bring him on. So I got a call from this guy, Mr. Whittaker, you're harassing my client. I said, no, your client is using my images without a license. I use that word instead of saying a copyright violation because I want to start
Right.
in this direction. But he's using my image without a license. Okay, I want to see a copy of your contract, a certificate of copyright registration, and the transparency on my desk in the morning. I said, I just realized you're two blocks away. Get off your tail and come down. I've got a light table. You can see the transparency. I've got the contracts, all the documentation, except the one thing I didn't mention to him, that I didn't have it registered. I didn't have a certificate of copyright registration. I didn't understand the value of that at the time.
Right.
That's the last time I tried bluffing. Oh, getting back to that first one, where I
Hmm.
saw the 9 images, about a year and a half later, they called to relicense the images again. So
Nice.
you're also educating clients by sticking to your guns. So I wanted to do that. I'm sorry, I'm bouncing back and forth, but that was the wake up call as far as the value of copyright registration. And
For sure.
there's some real ramifications to reinforce it. Uh, and we can talk about that later. In my seminar, Protecting Your Intellectual Property, I get into that quite a bit.
Nice.
It's something that is just, I can't pound it into people, the value of that.
Absolutely. So talk to me a little bit about pricing. You touched on it depending on the usage and those types of things, but let's learn a little bit from your experience around pricing. How do you develop your pricing? And yeah. Just how do you develop your pricing?
Usage, depending on the type of usage, how it's going to be used, the time involved. And
Mhm.
again, I work with a creative fee now instead of a day rate. And the difference between a day rate, you're locked into a specific time or beyond that. But it doesn't include the licensing. It does not include the prep time. It doesn't include anything that goes into project coordination. I got into some pretty interesting projects where I would light up entire buildings and
Mm.
having to deal with permits, everything else. Um, a day rate doesn't cover that. And it's one of
100%.
those things where you have to people that's the first question they ask you, what's your day rate? And I go into it saying it doesn't cover that. So I break it down in that direction. I had a case where, and this is what I was going to mention. I had a case where I got a call from an art director in Chicago wanting me to photograph a brand new condominium in San Francisco. This is around 2008, 2009. It was a 60-story tower, which is unusual for San Francisco. And he went over their requirements. Number one, they wanted to have global unlimited rights. Okay, check that box. They wanted to spread it out. They wanted to split it between four different entities. Okay, that's another thing to consider. They they wanted, I think, some like approximately 30 sunrises, sunsets, and interiors of the complex. It was a beautiful complex.
Wow.
So I said, okay, who's my competition? He said, there's only one other guy. His name's Mark Darley. I know Mark. We did a project with Architectural Digest together a couple of years ago. He's a great photographer. I really have a deep admiration for him. The guy broke out laughing. I said, "What's so funny?" He said the same thing about you.
Nice.
I just got a call from Mark a couple of days ago, and it's the friendships you build in this community. And what the point I'm making is, I called him up and I said, "How are you going to deal with this? You know, this is more than just a buyout. They really have some overreaching terms in this." And he said, "I know, I know. Um, I'm we can't really tell people what to charge, but we can share information. You can't
Right.
really collaborate because that's called price
Mhm.
fixing to a certain degree.
Right, of course, yeah.
And that's one thing that I want people to really consider that you can't really tell people what to charge, but you can share information. And Mark and I had 3 or 4 phone calls where I was going to charge about 10 times my creative fee, and he was going to do about the same thing. Uh, we went ahead and sent our estimates in. He was a little more expensive than I was, but we were pretty close. And the he called me up and said, "Steve, the client just choked on the numbers." I said, "It doesn't
Oh, no.
surprise me." Well, they called back, both of us, and they said, "We're going to renegotiate." Two of the entities dropped out, and we're going to go with national advertising, regional advertising. I think this is before, no, web was just coming in, so web was part of it,
Right.
and print. So we estimated again, sent it in. They choked on the numbers again, so they got it down to more limited use, where it was just regional advertising, web, print, and that was pretty much it. I ended up getting a job, and Mark and I still talk today about that. It was a wonderful experience. The whole point I'm making is we're a community,
Right.
connect with each other. Fast forward a few years later, many years later, uh, photo code comes in. And I use photo quote a lot. When it first came out, you guys were way off target, but over the years, you've evolved and you've developed
Mhm.
some pretty close numbers. Your tips are amazing. And again, you never paid me to say this. This is just something that I'm just, but the one thing I want to let people know is it's only a starting point. You know,
Right.
it's just a starting point. All you're doing is just giving people comparative numbers to look at and to explore. But it's just a starting point, and for good reason. Regional zones have different pricing structures or values. Some just don't have the
100%.
economy to support higher levels, and that's part of negotiating, finding out what their needs are, and just pricing your structure to meet those needs.
We've talked about a couple of things and where we've said we'd like to get back to it later. So what else do you want to add? What other wisdom and experience do you think creates value for folks without giving your intellectual property of your workshops away?
No, I freely share my information. If somebody has a question, I'm willing to. Having mentors was a big help, and I've mentored with a couple of the areas up here as well as down in the Bay Area. I would recommend people try and find a mentor if they're starting out, if they can. So, talk to people, just go back and forth and ask questions, And don't hit them all at once. Will you be my mentor? But just ask them for various questions. I've been so fortunate in my life as far as the people that I've met. I've tried to turn it around, and when it's your turn, do the same thing. That's
Mhm.
pretty much it. Um, as far as I've pretty much covered a lot of the things that I was going to in that
You
state.
talked a little bit, you said, let the remind you to come back to the security around the models.
Yeah, couple of times. Project. Let's talk about project coordination. I had a couple of projects back around 2005, 2006. The architect was an amazing architect, and he kept promising he'd take care of it. We did a Xerox corporate headquarters in Palo Alto, and
Mm,
yeah, I'll let him know you're coming. So I checked in with the property manager. I didn't know you're coming, so he said I'll put you in touch with security. So I contacted security. Nobody told me you're coming. Communications breakdown. So that was the first case. So I went ahead and got letters from everybody, made copies of them, sent emails back and forth, and we got to the. I had a binder with all the paperwork, certificates of insurance, everything that I needed, full documentation. I got to the front desk to let them know who we were. Nobody told me you're coming. That's three times. We got that squared away. It took an hour. I wasted an hour, but I had that documentation. It solved a bunch of problems. He still had to make some phone calls, but we lost an hour. And you're chasing sunlight. We were
mm,
shooting desks, so we needed to light up the building. We had a lift. We were going to be. We had lights all the way around the building. I use quartz halogen, uh, and
oh,
I haven't switched to LED um, because of the type of lighting that I do. It seems to work fairly well,
right.
but it's one of those things when you're dealing with security, you've got to let everybody know, including security. We did the Hyatt Regency Embarcadero, I think around 99. We did it three times before they they were about to demolish part of it on the interior and redo it. We ended up using close to 80,000 watts of light to light their atrium because it was a cave. And I had assistants. I probably had about six assistants. Every 12 hours, I'd swap out assistants so they'd be fresh. I worked straight through 37 hours. I will never do that
Wow.
again. My hairline went back at least 5 feet.
I imagine.
But we did it a second time. By then, we had everything pretty much down. And we had, again, security was helping us out, working with us. Crowd control was a big thing. Risk mitigation is a big issue. You want to use gaffer's tape to tape everything down. Well, security came up to me. We were photographing this mall in San Mateo, California. And they said, we just caught this lady on camera making 6 attempts to trip over your tape. I said, you got to be kidding. People think that we have deep pockets. And
Mm,
they, especially the developers, have deep pockets, so they're going after anybody. I use gaffer's tape, and I don't I use cable tape, and I tape the cable tape down with gaffer's tape, and it's bright fluorescent orange or yellow.
mhm,
And when they booted this lady out, they said, "You deserve an Oscar, but don't ever come back." It's just one of those things where people are going to either have nefarious opportunities or they have accidents, and you want to make sure that you're avoiding it. It's risk mitigation every way you can, working with electricity, the whole thing. You want to make sure
right.
that people are safe. Uh, Pretty much it. Oh, getting back to that one I was talking about, the Alcazar Theater after the '89 quake, I was photographing a scale model in the studio of an architectural site. It was going to be a senior assisted living facility in San Francisco. And right across the street was this rooftop access I needed. So we cleared it with the property owners. They let us up there, and I set up my 4x5. This is about a year or two before I switched to digital. So I had my signers set up, and I just went ahead and got this beautiful sunlight. I turn around, there are these thunderclouds coming in. It's a Friday night, and the door is locked. So if
Mm,
you're in that state, make sure you use something to block the door. I didn't have a cell phone back then. So
right.
maybe I did, I don't remember, but I yelled out to a guy who's coming down an ocean grade crane ladder, and this window opens up, and this guy, again with the New York accent, says, "Buddy, you want to get across? If you want off that roof, you got to walk across this plank." It was a glue lamp. It's about maybe 2 inches thick, 30 inches wide. I had an anvil case, 4x5 anvil case that gets a tripod, and I think that's one of the two times I had a fear of heights. It's a 6 story
Mhm.
drop. And
Oh,
if you're getting midway on that glue lamp, it starts gently bouncing a little bit. And he kept coaxing me through, and I pushed the tripod and the camera case ahead of me and got it into the window, and I was out of there. But I now bring a 2x4 with me to block doors. and I use that as security with them. I do a lot of building-to-building rooftop photography, and I'll send you one of the images that I found multiple copyright images on. Uh, I handled this 124-story tower that I lit up in San Francisco. I can't use that term light up anymore. I illuminated.
There we
Sometimes
go.
people get upset when you talk about lighting up a building, so I can't use that term anymore. But um, we used a high rise that was about a block away as one camera position. We had two other camera positions for that. And we used our lights to illuminate the building, both on the roof of that building, the sides, and washing the face of the building itself. It was way too much work. About 2 weeks later,
Wow,
I get a call, and the film permits are required, everything that was
of
involved.
course.
Uh, 2 weeks later, I get a call from an art director in New York wanting me to photograph a bunch of high rises around the country. And I swore that's the last time I lit up a high rise. I think what really there was a bit of fatal attraction, and
Right.
they lit up the Marriott hotel, and that's what I was driving to San Francisco and I saw that. I got to do that one of these days.
Wow, yeah.
So you're talking about
That
pricing.
creative brain, right? Where you go,
Yep.
"Ooh, that would be really cool to do."
So you talk about pricing. You have to build all that product coordination into the pricing factor, into your expenses, rental. One guy wanted 5,000 for the parking lot. I said, "You got to be kidding!" And I found Plan B very quickly. It was Caltrans was they had a vacant ramp, so I used that as a for a bank of my lights and other areas. But again, you have to get film permits. You have to, and that could be really arduous sometimes. Uh, there's a lot involved in that. When I ended up going, my first stop was Buffalo. We photographed a building in Buffalo, natural light, at dusk and pre-dawn. I did it again. I went back to my roots, just falling in love with natural lighting again. I went to New York. I think it was Avenue of the Americas, which was a high-rise tower. So I used a 20-story tower to light that one. Uh, and then I ended up going down to New Orleans, I guess, not New Orleans, anyhow. Metairie, Louisiana, about three or four other spots, back to St. Louis, and finally Chicago. And about uh, 3 years ago, I started finding my images on reverse image searches from this project's 10 years ago. And sure enough, the property manager, sure, you can use the image. So I've been getting a lot of money from licensing my work, going after these people. And the way I handle it, I don't take them to court. I don't threaten them. I just say I've discovered through reverse image searches uh, the usage, unlicensed usage of my images of these projects in whatever city it is. And this is my copyright certification and registration number. This is the image number itself. We expect this payment to be made. One company FedExed a payment within 24 hours. A
Right.
lot of times it takes up to 6 to 8 weeks. And again, I'm not badgering them. I'm just sending them a very friendly letter that I developed that worked. And it's just one of those things where if you handle it in a way where you want to be treated, chances are they're going to respond the same way. I am
Nice.
dealing with a couple of companies right now where they have barriers trying to reach people, and I'm finding that's really frustrating. So I'm starting to work with Pixie.com, and I'm starting to work with another company, Image Rights. And so far, I'm starting to make some headway through them as well. I'm turning them over to companies that are using my image with social networking and other things. It's really frustrating when people rip off your work. You got to get paid for the work that you do, and
Mhm.
if you don't, you're giving your work away.
Right, right. And so that it speaks back again to what you talked to about copywriting and registering your images, right? If you have that, then people have no ground to stand on. If they're using your images, and you can say, "Here, look,
Well,
this is me, this is mine.
yeah.
It's not yours."
There are two key elements in illegal usage. One is willful. The other one is honest, if you want to call it that, honest infringement, where they thought they had access to it. I worked with the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library's Air Force One Pavilion in 2006. I'm still finding my images showing up with tourist companies, other companies using it. I'm sending Pixie after them right now, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I contacted the director of public relations who's still there from 2006, and she said, absolutely, we did not allow anybody to use those images. Somehow they did screen grabs, but they got hold of the images. And it's just one of those things where you just have to keep at it.
Yeah,
Uh, it's been
absolutely.
it's been a year with challenges, so I've kept out of trouble by going after these people as well.
Perfect. A little extra money in your pocket for the images that you took time and energy to create.
Yep.
absolutely worth the time to do it, right?
The key word is your intellectual property, and you have to defend it.